coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a movement among young women, and it's kind of an inchoate movement as it stands, and it's certainly not coded with all of the precise rhetorical niceties that like an AEI scholar would like, but it's there just the same, nevertheless, of people waking up to like the entire consequence of the sexual and social revolutions of the 60s and 70s and saying this is a raw deal. Like, we didn't ask for this. We weren't there. It's kind of like they've woken up with the hangover, but they didn't get to go to the party because all of the hippie orgiastic fun like happened way before them. And they just grew up with parents that kind of passed these values along to them. And I think, discontent is an appropriate response to that sort of scenario. Welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and editor James Poulos, coming to you live from Las Vegas, where I have been attending the Power Slap competition event. I hesitate to call it a sport, hosted by the UFC, known for its mega viral clips you may have seen online. I could write a whole little essay about it, but I will spare you at this moment and instead start talking about Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House. My goodness, they actually did it. They those crazy kids, by gum, they elected a House Speaker. He's a representative from Louisiana. He was relatively little known, I would say, before this moment, but he also, intriguingly, seems to actually represent some of the values of the Freedom Caucus, which, as you will recall, is the group of people that sort of started this whole process rolling in the first place. Matt Gaetz calling for the vote to motion to vacate and kicking out Kevin McCarthy. We've been talking for several weeks now about whether this was a successful gambit, whether this was smart or dumb, or what. And I guess, if the ends justify the means, this kind of looks like a win. A few things that people have been noting, both his enemies and his friends have been noting, that Mike Johnson has a pretty solid record on fiscal responsibility vis-a-vis Ukraine. He gets an F rating from the Republicans for Ukraine group, which effectively means that he's voted against all of these massive funding bills after the first one. He also sponsors and has introduced a number of bills that do seem to represent a strong commitment to cultural conservatism, you might say. He sponsors a national abortion ban. Ever since the Dobbs decision came down, he's been trying to get that through. He introduced a federal act called Stop the Sexualization of Children, which basically would have moved the sort of Florida legislation to a national level and prevented or withdrawn federal funds from schools where teachers are trying to talk to kids about sex and transgenderism and so forth. Here's a few quotes from our new Speaker of the House, just to give you a flavor of what he's got to say. He has announced, "My office is going to be known for members being more involved and having more influence in our processes." That's another kind of procedural concern of the Freedom Caucus. Here's a tweet. "And now, finally, because Roe v. Wade was overturned last summer and Louisiana is now a proudly pro-life state, we will get the number of abortions to zero." A few concerns from the right have also been raised. In particular, I've seen a lot of people passing around this video of Johnson on PBS, talking about what the left would call systemic racism. This has been kind of excerpted, I think, a little bit out of context. When you listen to the whole clip, he's talking about his two sons, one of whom is black, and he says they have different challenges. My son Jack has an easier path. The reality is, and no one can tell me otherwise, my son Michael had a harder time than my son Jack is going to have, simply because of the color of his skin. So he was speaking from direct experience, but he did then go on to say, I think that we really do need systematic change. I think we need transformative solutions. So naturally, this has raised some alarm bells and concerns, but generally it looks like the read is kind of positive. What do you guys think? Had you heard of a lot about Mike Johnson before? And do you agree that this sort of represents a win for the Freedom Caucus?
Well, nothing but respect for Mike Johnson. I like the stock. I think this is probably a lot better of an outcome than any of the other scenarios that seemed like they might solidify into a speakership and a trajectory for House Republicans, who are, to be sure, a beleaguered bunch. Democracy is not always a good time, and the bickering and the self-owns that we saw throughout this process certainly did not bode well for the party. But sometimes you come out of those painful moments in life a little bit stronger, and that's good for the self-confidence. And maybe even along with that self-confidence comes, God forbid, some humility. So I think that's all to the good. I'm inclined at this stage to focus on what's obviously the most important factor of them all, which is appearances. Mike Johnson's photo from when he was a younger man making the rounds on Twitter, where he indisputably wins the Green Line contest, where for those who are not in the know, the idea is if you are photographed as a man with a woman next to you, the line representing your spine needs to be like perpendicular with the floor, whereas the woman, if she respects and admires and perhaps even loves you, is her spine is at a tilting inward toward you. Johnson is actually leaning out somewhat with a pelvic thrust forward, and an admiring young lady who I don't know her identity. Maybe that'll come out at some point this week. Is affectionately leaning very, very far inward. It looks like it's somebody's birthday. So that's a good sign. But the irony, of course, is that Mike Johnson, present day, also resembles generic Republican, that mythical figure who pulls so well and yet is so difficult to actually incarnate in a particular flesh and blood individual Republican. The sort of person who looks like Glenn Youngkin, but obviously not enough buzz around Youngkin to catapult him to the next level. Maybe Mike Johnson will be different. Maybe he will help offset the vibes thrown off of Congressman Gaetz, who does he look somewhat like a character from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? Yes. Does he have a sort of Gavin Newsom vibe to him? Yes. I'm not going to go as far as the critics who say that he looks like a dark triad person, but he does have, let's just say, more of an edge and more of a perhaps combative vibe than Mike Johnson. So this is obviously a win for Big Mike. He seems to be ready to fulfill the duties of the office. But in some respects, it's even a bigger win for Gaetz. And he took a big gamble. It did pay off. This is definitely not the last you'll hear of Gaetz, and maybe he is ascended to the level of Gaetz keeper.
Yeah, I would say that, Mike Johnson looks sort of like the popular jock that was nevertheless nice to you at recess, whereas Matt Gaetz looks a little bit like the guy from that cartoon Doug who wears the leather jacket, has green skin. I forget his name, but the villain in that TV show. So distinct physiognomies, at least.
I'll take both of those physiognomies as representatives of our party. That's okay, or our party, the party, whatever. I had never heard of Mike Johnson before. I'm not scared to admit that. I'm not ashamed, but from everything I've heard, he sounds good. I like that he's sort of a fighter. I just looked up that Green Line photo, and yeah, he's definitely a real Chad. And, regarding what he said about his black son, I mean, here's the thing. I don't think anybody's going to deny that black people have a different experience in America than white people.
Right.
I think the problem is when you try to figure out, well, what do we do about that? And I didn't really get the sense that he was saying we need to uh, have the government step in and fix everything so everything turns out exactly the same for everybody. So I don't. I think maybe people. And look, if you've adopted a black kid, I guess you're going to have your own view on the issue and probably your own unique perspective and whatever. God bless him. So I like the idea that he's going to confront the Dems. I hope he releases all those hours of J6 footage that we were promised. I hope he impeaches Biden and Mayorkas and everybody else he can in the administration. Why not? I mean, they're working really hard to put Trump in prison. So the least we can do is, give them something back in return. So I mean, it seems fine to me. I have no qualms. I would prefer to have. I came up with a new line. It's okay to be defeated, but it's not okay to be defeatist.
Mm.
And I sort of feel like if we're going to be defeated, fine, but let's not plan to be defeated.
Totally. Yeah. The despair porn among certain conservatives is just off the chain. Like the degree to which some online commentators and indeed some elected representatives and people on Fox News seem to desire defeat, be excited and delighted when they're proven right in all of their predictions about how things are going wrong. Like that to me is just wild. There really is a degree, I think, to which if you can definitively prove how everything is going to terribly fall apart, you get to feel sort of in the know. And often this translates to a a kind of searching moral inventory of every public figure who emerges with some sort of positive vision for the right. And Mike Johnson is no different. I feel like this thing where people are digging up this PBS interview. There was also a tweet where he said something about Zelensky's speech to Congress that he thought it was stirring or something. People that are in public office, they have to kind of hedge their bets at first on any issue, I feel like. And all of these statements, it strikes me, they all come kind of right after some new current thing emerged. And at that point, everybody was sort of okay, so here are some, as you sort of said, Seth, here are some things, baseline things that we can agree on. And that's kind of what Johnson is saying in this interview. He does not say, this systematic change that we need is to overhaul meritocracy and make sure that every movie contains mostly non-white people. That word has now become just a total live wire. It sends a shiver up anybody's spine who hears it, because we've now seen what it means. But if you're a politician doing an interview in a moment of high racial tension, I don't see why I guess saying these sorts of things in that kind of moment does not mean that you are ready to capitulate or that you're a squish on CRT or anything like that. I mean, I just think give the guy the benefit of the doubt at the very least, since I know that we are not the only people on this podcast who just heard of Mike Johnson for the first time. I mean, I really somebody tweeted out, I have strong and informed opinions about Mike Johnson, a man whose career I have been following for years. There's a lot of that energy going on as well on the internet. And yeah, I mean, to me, the most remarkable part of this is the gamble and the payoff, just the fact that they actually made it. With these sorts of things, it's if you throw a Hail Mary pass and the guy catches it in the end zone, then it was a great decision. And if you throw the exact same pass and there's nobody there to catch it, like you're a terrible loser and you made a terrible decision. And I feel like a lot of times you don't know if like which one it's going to be. And I do still feel like they didn't really have a plan here, but also they did something. And this is, as we've been saying, like an area in which Congress is often stalemated. And they were heading up on a government shutdown. They wanted to get actual motion on something that never produces any outcomes. Now the playing field is a little different because of Israel and all the stuff that's happened since Gaetz called for this vote. But I don't know, man. Like, if you come for the king and you don't miss, then like I guess that makes you the king.
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed with Matt Gaetz. I really am. I mean, that guy is steely, and he's got a lot of nerve. I mean, that he blocked McCarthy for his initial election, and then that he deposed him. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah,
it's just bizarre to think of like some random junior congressman doing anything. So I mean, I don't know if he's a junior congressman, but he hasn't. It's not like he's like in leadership. So whatever. More power to him.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, and there's I guess we should say something about Johnson coming out and saying, my first act as speaker is going to get Israel aid passed, and of course, conspicuously absent from that sentence was the word Ukraine. Just at that cut alone, I think there are some pretty significant geopolitical implications of Johnson's assent, if I can put it that way. It's we kind of got into this situation in the first place because of controversy over the way that Ukraine funding might be bundled into legislation and sort of squeezed through against the opposition of many Republicans. And now we're in a situation here where, yes, it looks all but certain that there's going to be Israel aid, and suddenly Ukraine is kind of at the back of the line. Obviously, all things Israel are flashpoints right now, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that and domestic protests or whatever and so forth. But what's interesting to me is, peace is good, generally speaking, and regional war that turns into global war, I think is especially bad right now. Everyone's itching for some sort of proof that they have what it takes to prevail in a digital war scenario. But that makes for a highly unstable and incredibly dangerous environment. So I think, what we might be likely to see is a kind of consensus position coming out of Congress where it's like, well, we don't really want war, and we might even be discouraging Israel from waging just as much war as they're inclined to do. But if we can reach that outcome by stroking a big check, then let's do that. And if we can do that without sending even more money and support against the will of the American people to Ukraine, then so much the better. That seems like it might be the new center of gravity in Congress. And considering all of the fractures, increasingly open fractures, in the executive branch, in the State Department, and even in the White House, that seems like a big deal to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's been, I would say, forgive my language, like a lot of around, not so much finding out yet. Like a lot of people indulging in a great deal of LARP-esque language about going to war with the world. Like, this is all one war. Ukraine. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week, that the gathering tide of darkness, the forces of Sauron are assembling in the east, and you really want to be very careful before you actually execute on that sort of talk. And I feel like a lot of our leaders and citizens alike kind of don't really think through what that actually looks like and means, especially, James, as you point out, under digital conditions. So a degree of caution and circumspection certainly merited, even though, cowardice is never appropriate. But like, if Israel becomes the sort of obvious ally that we agree to support financially, while this Ukraine business kind of fades into the background, and if Johnson sort of sees the opportunity to encourage that state of affairs, then he really will be a big deal. And Gaetz, by turn, will also have been a big deal. So, I mean, we can certainly like pray to God that degree of like prudence and sanity obtains. We should, yeah. Let's now turn to talking about kind of Israel at home. The first thing that Johnson's House has done is hold this motion to suspend the rules and agree, standing with Israel as it defends itself against the barbaric war launched by Hamas and other terrorists. And for all that, we've seen a lot of really disturbing and frankly quite bloodthirsty rhetoric about this at home. This resolution was passed, or the motion rather was passed by an overwhelming majority. In total, we got 412 yay votes, 10 nay votes, and 6 present votes, with 5 people not voting. 10 nay votes, 9 of those were one of those was a Republican, Thomas Massey of Kentucky. All the rest were Democrats, 9 Democrats, including the usual suspects. I mean, Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Andrea Carson, Al Green, AOC, Summerlee. These names are exactly the ones that you would expect, and they're saying exactly what we know that they believe, which is like, yay, Hamas. I'm only being a little bit facetious there. So that's the state of affairs in Congress. Meanwhile, in Europe and here as well, there have been a lot of like quite alarming pro-Hamas rumblings, especially bears mentioning and noticing on college campuses. Most recently, 4 students at George Washington University are under threat of expulsion for having projected "Glory to Our Martyrs" onto the side of the library building. They also projected "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." At Cooper Union, some Jewish students found themselves barricaded in the library as Palestine demonstrators banged on the door. That video in particular, if you look it up, maybe we can drop the link in the show notes, is just sort of harrowing to watch, and looks like something out of if history textbooks had video in them, it looks like something out of a history textbook right before some, God forbid, like dreadful pogrom or something. So, scary stuff. Barry Weiss's offices, the Free Press, were vandalized with all sorts of nasty messages. Yeah, I guess taking these two things together, and given what we've just said about aid in Congress, what do you guys, it can be very difficult in sort of social media land to get a read on sort of the mood generally, or how representative these kind of unsettling and extreme videos are. I do get the impression, though, that there is something just really dark going on, especially on college campuses when it comes to Hamas.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Like, I'm in New York, and, looking at social media, you would think that there's essentially a civil war going on.
Well, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right. But then, like, walking around outside, and this is like all over downtown New York, I mean, I guess yesterday I encountered a protest outside Hunter College.
Okay.
And I mean, they're having their protests, but aside from protesters, one doesn't really get the sense from, the other 99% of people on the street that they're taking a position. It's not like with many of these social media inspired um, debates or whatever, or arguments, it doesn't necessarily seem to be translating to reality on a one-to-one correspondence. I will say that what's really interesting to me is, okay, until like a few weeks ago, the whole discourse about Israel in the West was based around the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions. And the whole premise of BDS was rights based. Okay, the whole idea was we just want Israel to comply with international law, and we want, they have 3 demands. Withdrawal from the occupation of the West Bank, return to the 67 borders, essentially letting the Palestinians come back to, their homes, which is a pretty big question. Oh, and like, free rights for the Arabs in Israel, which they basically have. But here's the point. It was ostensibly rights-based.
Yeah.
Okay. And they would say, well, we're agnostic on the question of two states or one state, which was bogus. I mean, that was like trick. But we've leapfrogged all of that. And now the standard line is the maximalist, like Hezbollah position, like going on about martyrs. That's bonkers talk. And also saying that, no, the whole state has to be erased. Like there is no Jewish state. There's no Israel. It's all Palestine. Like, we don't want no two state. We want 48. From the river to the sea. You know what's funny? Apparently, that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Yeah,
is an adaptation of an Arabic slogan, which goes from the water to the water, Palestine will be Arab. So it's actually much more overtly eliminationist, overtly genocidal, since that's the word they like to use.
Right.
But it's fascinating that, another thing that we hear now is they don't talk about 67 anymore. They say 75 years of apartheid, occupation, colonialism, blah, blah, blah. So basically 48. The idea is that partition of Palestine was illegitimate from the beginning. Israel has no right to exist. There is no such thing as Israeli. There's no such thing as Israel. It's all an illegal settlement. So that's where this whole idea that the people, the civilians who were killed by Hamas a couple weeks ago, that they were colonists. They were on stolen land. But that area was always considered, like even in the original partition, that was considered Israel. That was given to the Jews. That was considered Israel.
Right.
So it's a very I mean, I saw the Cooper Union stuff. I don't really understand exactly what the situation was. It looks pretty harrowing. I mean, Saturday, there's going to be a big rally at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, which is very near Crown Heights, and where a lot of the Hasidic Jews live. And the police said, "Look, if you're Jewish, it's probably better to stay away from Grand Army Plaza that day."
I mean,
that's a little crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, dude, that's more than a little crazy. I mean, this is the thing about it is, okay, so maybe Twitter is not real life. A sort of asterisk on that, I think, because to a greater and greater extent, like people's connection to Twitter is somehow deeper and more immediate than their connection to quote unquote real life. But even so, as you rightly point out, Seth, these aren't representative videos in any sense of the word. But you just don't. This is America, God damn it! Like we shouldn't ever be in a situation where Jewish people feel like they have to hide or curtail their Judaism. Like, I'm sorry, but that's just like that shit won't fly, And so that would ever be a warning that was issued by the police is to me kind of grotesque. And then on top of that, the stuff about the students and this masks off thing where they used to sort of say, oh yeah, it's this is a concentration camp that they're putting the Palestinians in, and like, these conditions are terrible, and that's what we object to, and we're having a kind of dispute over that. All of that has sort of vanished. It was never really, if you look at what Hamas says about what it wants, that was never part of their objectives. This has always been a explicitly sort of exterminationist idea. And, there's been these arguments forever about like, can you be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic or whatever? And it's like, yes, in principle, of course you can. I mean, in principle, you can have all sorts of concerns or critiques about how the nation of Israel manages its territory and so forth. But in practice, what we're looking at is almost always like from the river to the sea. And somebody tweeted out, this sort of Bill Ackman, I don't know who this guy is, but he's got a huge following and seems sort of like a normie, nice normie. He goes, anti-Israel has become anti-Semitism. And it's just like, I don't know, dude, like, you seen that meme with the astronauts looking at Earth and one of them got a gun? Like, always kind of has been. And this stuff gets sort of quietly made more and more explicit at the universities, I think, because still, despite everything we've learned and seen, people don't really pay that much attention to what's being said on campuses or take it all that seriously. And they kind of write it off as just stuff that kids say. And then you turn around and something like this happens, and suddenly the ball has moved like 10 paces, 10 yards down the field. And the same sort of freshmen, undergraduates that were saying like BDS before are now just turning right around and saying like, God bless our martyrs. So yeah, I mean, Inez Stepman is always talking about this, that like, if you think that this is just kind of youthful dalliance, it's going to evaporate. At this point, I think it is kind of inexcusable, and I think like it's definitely true that this does not represent the majority of people, but it sure represents a very loud, ascendant, and young minority.
Let me just throw in one thing, which is I the phrase anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, or does not equal anti-Semitism. I noticed that that's been kind of adopted with a funny corollary. And it's like an interesting example of logical misprision. What you hear now is essentially what people think is anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I am an anti-Zionist. Therefore, I am not an anti-Semite. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And in fact, it's gone to the point where I've now seen things just like a few weeks ago, like one of these like radical groups in New York, that's supposedly a Jewish group, was saying, in fact, support for Israel, Zionism, is anti-Semitism because it leads to Jews being harmed.
Yeah.
So right, because you'll make Hamas mad at you.
Yeah. There must be some Latin name for this particular.
I'll look it up.
He implies you, and then you mistake that for he implies not you. I mean, that is really interesting.
Yeah, to me at least, surprising no one, this is just further evidence that we are in a technological environment that makes theological disputes and religious patterns of thinking and matters of spiritualism come roaring back to the kind of default Western way of war, which is religious conflict. In a world where Christianity is a dwindling force on many campuses, things like this become possible. I mean, some of this is the result of NGOs, new governmental organizations, like the Tides Foundation, just spinning up these networks, and poof, you have big crowds of people all with these Palestinian flags. Where did they get them? How did they get them? Why do they all have this similar signs? This is kind of astroturfed in a way, but it's activating sentiment, sort of theological intersectionality, where maybe these kids aren't protesting because they believe that that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah or what have you, but because they want to make some high level spiritual affirmations about who belongs on their multi-striped flag. And as this kind of thing plays out, controversies that seemed, it was, people laugh at Jake Sullivan for having this foreign affairs piece saying the Middle East has never been quieter in 2 decades, and then the online version comes out today and it's all been edited and changed and redacted because it's been obsolesced on arrival. But debates over Zionism that have a theological weight to them, yes, it's not surprising to see this come back in a digital age. And I think we need to bear in mind that there are, in fact, multiple flavors of Zionism out there, and one of them is expressly theological, and one of them is, I think, a little bit more practical or historical. So you have Christians out there, evangelicals, who, Christian Zionism, this is the right thing to do because the Bible says so. We must support Israel. And then you have other Christians who say, well, no, the real Israel is the Christian church, and the real kingdom of heaven, the real Holy Land, is in your heart. And this is all sort of, a ridiculous or a theological mistake to think that Zionism is the will of God. But nevertheless, you can have a view of Israel, which is, okay, Judea really existed, and that was the Jewish nation, and they, lost really bad in a war a long time ago and got scattered all over the place. And it's not really that unreasonable or ridiculous to think that they would want to return to Judea and ramp their nation back up. And lo and behold, that occurred. And yes, history ain't beanbag, and the Ottomans controlled that area for a long time, and then they lost World War One, and then you have the British Mandate, and decisions get made, and Balfour Declaration, and you can't sort of unravel that knot without going back to the Precambrian era in a quest for some sort of cosmic justice. But that's what social justice does, and that's why it's so ridiculous. Is you need a supercomputer to adjudicate these disputes, and in some sense, they really ultimately can't be adjudicated in that way. And so there's Israel, and it's full of Israeli Jews, and what are you going to do about it? Are you going to agitate for the destruction of that regime, or are you going to say, let's face it, there are winners and losers in the Middle East, and the Israelis are the winners, and it would be sort of ridiculous or unjust or insane or just like not a good idea prudentially to try to blow that up, especially for religious reasons. And I think, despite the fact that a lot of college students are bugging right now, and despite the fact that a lot of Muslims are obviously very agitated, I still think the center of gravity in the U.S. is with, if not Christian Zionism, then at least the kind of commonsensical Israel exists, deal with it approach, which is going to lead toward long-term support for Israel. I am hearing things, I'm seeing polls. Oh no, Israel's going to lose American public support within a generation. I wouldn't be so sure. I think that it's definitely American in the deepest sense to say you should not be arrested for waving a Palestinian flag, in the same way that it's American in the deepest sense to say Jews should be able to go about their business in everyday life without being under a special pall of threat or fear. So I do think that cooler heads are going to prevail in this country. That doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a lot of choppy sort of unrest, as there has been in this country also for a very long time. The religious sands are shifting, and I think that's going to continue. But in the end, the problem of the radicalization of the youth is still very much a problem that has to do with the way that the left has constituted itself and the boundaries that it has been willing to push. And if there's going to be blowback in that regard, I think that it's long overdue.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, there's been all of this talk, of course, about, queers for Palestine, or Rashida Tlaib, I think, had the gay flag outside, or the Borg trans gay flag outside her office alongside, her own kind of support for Hamas and stuff. And everybody's been saying, it's so inconsistent. They throw gays off of roofs in these Middle Eastern countries, and Hamas would slaughter you instantly, and sex workers would be imprisoned and whatever. And I feel like there is something missing from this, which is that the inconsistency is only actually on one side. It's an asymmetrical inconsistency. Yes, it's true that real believers in Allah are none too friendly toward the sort of global American empire's main cultural export, which is kind of trans soup. But it's definitely not true that sort of Palestine, or what Palestine and Hamas represent in the minds of the Borg people, it's not true that that's incompatible or inconsistent with the trans gay flag. It's actually perfectly consistent, because there is a theological slurry going on in that wing of the Democratic Party, or in that vanguard of the left, that just assimilates every victim and every cause and indeed every sort of misfit or supposed outcast into one kind of global world order. And that is one of the theologies that is competing right now in the American context, in the American public square, which is really what we're talking about. Like yes, there are other sort of disputes going on between Jews and Muslims and so forth, who are that look much more orthodox and recognizable in comparison to the holy books. But over here, there's a slightly different theological war going on. One of the major contenders in which is Borg faith. And yeah, James, I think like it's always struck me, especially having spent a lot of my life in Europe, like that Americans don't even really understand how philo-Semitic they are in comparison to the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the West. I have often had to explain to my like evangelical friends, God bless them, what such things as the concept of the blood libel are, because there's just such an instinct, whatever your stance on like dispensationalism or the theological question of, you know, the Israel of the flesh versus Israel of the spirit. And like, yeah, you can go back and read like Bernard of Clairvaux about he who kills a Jew kills Christ, or, you know, you can read Augustine about all of this. And so there is something that is sort of deep in the Christian tradition about having a special concern for the Jews, and it's figured in all sorts of theological ways. But whatever your attitude is about that, there's just a default instinct, I think, among kind of like liberal Protestants or whatever you want to call them, to feel a certain affection for Judaism and to not, and to like really be revolted by extreme expressions of anti-Semitism in a way that is not, I don't think, true necessarily in the European nations, which have a much kind of darker history with this stuff. And so all of this simply to say, I think that like the instinct and the default is always going to remain until, you know, if these kids take over, then it's another thing. But there's like a lot of just animosity toward anybody that shouts things like glory to our martyrs. And, you know, I hope that animosity burns brightly. And I'm actually like pretty okay with these kids, you know, facing disciplinary consequences at their university for what they're doing. But
yeah. Hey, can I just throw in one thing?
Please.
Well, regarding this question of you know, the trans soup, as you put it, like to describe the left's you know, position on things. I did see this funny sign, and it was huge. It was this gigantic hand-painted banner that stretched across a whole avenue that some protesters were carrying that said, "Reproductive freedom means freedom for Palestine."
Right, which makes no sense unless
it makes no logical sense, except it makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
Because it's the old Leninist thing, like who says A must say B. So you can't disagree. And, you know, I just want to point something out. Like the Democrats have just been, and the national media have just been chortling over the Republican difficulty in electing a speaker. And, oh my God, look what they did. They're such a clown show. I mean, look, having a crisis of leadership within, you know, the legislature and, you know, the party at that level, that's one thing. But I mean, the Democrats have a serious Hamas problem.
Yeah.
And that's going to be much larger. I mean, I've said before on the show, like Jewish donors comprise 50 to 75% of all donations to the Democrat Party. We've all seen and read about various billionaires like Bill Ackman saying, like, I'm not giving any more money to Harvard or any of these schools until they get their act together on this stuff. Well, the same thing's got to be happening at the top levels of the Democrat Party. I assume. I mean, I don't know, but I've got to imagine that funding, that donations must be way down.
Yeah.
Or there's threats of it. And this is probably why Biden ran off to Israel, you know, to demonstrate support and try to shore it up. I don't know. I think that assuming the Democrats have a convention, you know, which would be weird not to. Although I guess Biden isn't doing the New Hampshire primary. But there's going to be Palestine flags all over the place, and they're not going to be able to keep them off the stage. It's going to be a mess. So, you know, let's see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you wrote on the site Seth, Hamas hates Israel because it's Jewish, but the American left hates Israel because it's white. And that is just a much stickier problem, because a lot of them, even if they are actually quite pro-Israel, a lot of Democrats, even if they have a lot of sympathies for Israel, have already totally bought in on the anti-white stuff and the kind of the larger package they purchase, and then they discover that it's not like Burger King. Like, you can't actually hold the Jew hatred because it's all part of one thing. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I hope it causes them like terrible chaos. I hope it totally bites them in the butt, because this is what they signed up for, even if they didn't know it. And that would be it would be nice to see this movement in disarray for once. We should just briefly touch, before we recommend pieces on the site, on this Twitter video. I guess it initially comes from TikTok. Every now and then I just like to subject the guys to talking about some viral trend, because I'm drunk with power. And this time around, I wanted to talk about this video. So this girl is complaining about working a 9 to 5 and the sort of associated commute time, because she has to go into the office. She's living in the city. She doesn't really have, a lot of time to herself. She can't work out. She can't cook meals, all of this stuff that she, would like. She pictures a life for herself of a little bit more leisure, whatever. Naturally, this has caused an online flame war. It went viral. This is kind of in the mode of, if you watched the fight over shakshuka girl, there was a woman who talked about how she was going to learn to make shakshuka because she didn't have kids, and she, it was okay that she wasn't married or didn't have kids, because she could spend her day however she wanted, and that included learning to make shakshuka. And then there were people criticizing this woman for being a childless wine aunt, and there were people defending her for just being a fun-loving shakshuka maker. Similarly, we now have kind of the doomer narrative about how Generation Z can't even handle working a 9 to 5 job, and this girl is so weak, and look at her crying about her just basic adult life. She does say it's her first job out of college, so and she sort of it opens her complaints by saying, I know I'm being kind of annoying and dramatic, but this is just, I'm sort of experiencing this world all of a sudden. And then there have been people kind of arguing, well, actually, this is kind of a heartless and drab world of drudgery that we have created for people, especially for women who we're supposed to want to go into the workforce and slave away at a 9 to 5. And for a long time, conservatives have been saying that's actually not some mark of privilege. That's something that men did in the suburbs to support their wives. And so I don't know. I just found this a very interesting kind of marker on where things are in the so-called war between the sexes. And I wondered what you guys make of it. I'm sort of sympathetic to the argument that says, okay, maybe you don't get on TikTok and cry about your problems if you don't want people to dissect them. But it feels to me as if, in fact, yes, urban life and 9 to 5 life has gotten incredibly difficult to bear. The screws have been tightened and constraints been squeezed upon how much free time people have. And all of it was sort of presented as this grand, fulfilling enterprise that was going to replace being a housewife or building a family and all that stuff. And I feel as if, in fact, maybe it's kind of a welcome thing that people are discovering that wasn't such a great deal to begin with. I feel kind of bad for this girl.
Yeah, I mean, look, feminism was from this perspective, was a huge scam perpetrated by capital. So, sure, you could look at it that way. And I mean, who can't sympathize with it? I mean, okay, I get it. Yeah, she's whiny and entitled, but I don't know. I mean, I guess I find it, I don't necessarily get into the whole neo-Victorian argument about work and the sanctity of work. I mean, look, I agree, you got to do it, but I mean, you'd be an idiot to argue with someone who says that, work generally sucks, especially if you're in your 20s and, you just got some drudge position. I mean, I don't know who's read The Abolition of Work by Paul Lafargue, but it's certainly worth looking at. I mean, it's a compelling perspective. I don't want to say that I'm in favor of technologically based radical communist luxury communism. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
But it's a point of view that's out there, and I don't think you want to just like say no. This is what everyone wants to do. This is what everyone should want to do. I mean, it sucks.
Right.
That's why we got the weekend and pensions and all of that other stuff. So we don't have to devote our lives to our all of our lives to the slog. But look, I mean, growing up, you kind of realize, okay, well, this is the sacrifice. One has to work, and this is how you earn your bread. I mean, this is probably like really like heterodox stuff on a conservative podcast. But,
Well, I know, for what? What is it all for? What is the measure of all things, and what does that measure have to do with the way I am spending my time and my life and my youth? These are eternal questions, and the secular answers on offer today are just not cutting it for a lot of people, and it's not puzzling to see why. The the bitter irony is that if you deleted all your social media, you would have a lot more spare time in which to live, doing things that are fruitful and productive, and spread the spirit throughout the social body. And what really hurts me is to see people on social media sort of crying from within. It's like going to the adoption shelter and you see all these like pathetic kitties and puppies behind this kind of bulletproof plexiglass, and they put their paws up on the glass and they meow at you, and it's we're reducing human beings to a really near subhuman condition. And in a way, we all bear some responsibility for that. And so until the day when we can all move out of our own sort of self-constructed adoption shelter known as the discourse, and get out of the realm of thinking and talking and into the realm of actually taking action to breathe life into our fellow human beings who are so obviously crying out to be let free from these enclosures, and then brought into enclosures of a different and better kind. Until we can make that leap, it's going to be very tempting for us to sit in our own little echo chambers and just lament the collapse of civilization.
Yeah, that's well said, James, and also physically painful. But yeah, I think like there's obviously a movement among young women, and it's kind of an inchoate movement as it stands, and it's certainly not coded with all of the precise rhetorical niceties that like an AEI scholar would like, but it's there just the same, nevertheless, of people waking up to like the entire consequence of the sexual and social revolutions of the 60s and 70s and saying this is a raw deal. Like, we didn't ask for this, we weren't there. It's kind of like they've woken up with the hangover, but they didn't get to go to the party because all of the hippie orgiastic fun like happened way before them, and they just grew up with parents that kind of passed these values along to them. And I think discontent is an appropriate response to that sort of scenario, to finding yourself in that condition. So is anger, so is like political mobilization. And I just think it's a mistake on the right to get down on these kids because what because my 9 to 5, because my Protestant work ethic, like I don't know, that stuff just doesn't really fly at this point in current year. Okay, let us now just briefly remind our listeners to read the damn site. We have a website. It's called AmericanMind.org. We don't just do a podcast. And we like to pick a piece or two from the site each week that we want you to pay special attention to. I'm going to recommend a piece called Founding Fathers and Red Caesar. It's by Casey Wheatland, who is a new author on our site. He is writing in defense, partially, of Kevin Slack, who has also written for us, but more generally about the concept of Red Caesar, which originates from a book by our own Mike Anton called The Stakes, in which he points out that if you believe, as many conservatives say they do, in things like the cycle of regimes or classical political philosophy, you start to look around at the oligarchic decay of our republic, and you maybe start like sweating a little bit under the collar and think, gee, this sure looks a lot like the conditions under which Plutarch says the Romans would have been happy if nothing worse than a dictator emerged. In other words, this like it's real Lyceum address hours here. It's real kind of tea leaf reading hours. And if you were into reading tea leaves, you might say this is the sort of situation in which an autocrat or as kind of new Augustus would take the reins and take control, be he red or blue. Mike argued that it could be a red Caesar, could be a blue Caesar. And what Wheatland is pointing out here is, first of all, none of that means, observing that does not mean that you endorse it. And observations are so often taken as endorsement in our current temperature, current climate, that's a helpful reminder, although I'm sure it won't stop the detractors from arguing against us in bad faith, but it bears repeating, like normative statements, descriptive statements rather, about political philosophy are not normative statements. Most people that talk about Red Caesar lament the condition that we find ourselves in that makes it even possible to think about. And also, and Wheatland then goes into some detail about this, John Adams and other founding fathers were not blind to the possibility of the situation. In fact, they were close readers of classical political philosophy, and they knew better than anybody that when you get to this point, these sorts of things can happen. Doesn't mean that they will. We can pray that they won't, but it's like, does nobody any favors or any good to pretend that it's just like not a real possibility. Okay, Seth, what do you got?
I recommend a piece by Brian Kennedy, former president of the Claremont Institute, called Warfare by Immigration. Brian very neatly characterizes China as our primary enemy and essentially the author of the current problems in the West regarding, the problems in Israel. And essentially he points out that by admitting millions and millions and millions of immigrants, the United States has essentially just imported a fifth column. And it is driven by China, and who backs Iran and backs Hamas and backs Hezbollah. And essentially here's the thing. Immigration is essential. What's the difference between mass migration and invasion? So I think that's the problem we've got here, and it's a great piece. Brian Kennedy, Warfare by Immigration.
Yeah, agreed. I thought that was one of the pieces that kind of cut through some of the noise on the Israel-Hamas thing, and I was glad that he sent it to us. James, what do you got?
I've got Margot Graves. She's an intern at the Claremont Institute. Always love to see our interns writing for TAM. The piece is Arkansas, red for the moment, blue for the future. And the argument is, hey guys, you look at these red states and sure, they're like 60% Republican in their voting patterns or what have you. But in the universities, there is trouble in paradise. And so long as we do not take action against the institutionalization of things like DEI, which I read the other day now has they're trying to add a B They're trying to add a B to DEI for belonging. So the spores continue to spread and take root and mushroom into something that has the power over time, especially our accelerating time, to turn red states blue. Verily, it is all connected, and everything that we've talked about today, I think, really is sort of epitomized or comes to a head in the American University current year. So read the piece, "Be Thou Shooketh," and remember not to take for granted those dark red states on the.
Yea, for none is unshooketh, no, not one. All right. With that, we thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about our projects and all that we do at the Claremont Institute, you can visit our various websites, including AmericanMind.org, but not limited to AmericanMind.org. We also have a sister publication, the Claremont Review of Books, which is a dead tree issue 4 times a year, plus online content. It's ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com with its associated podcast as well. Plus, check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And finally, if you like what we do and you want to support our mission, we would be extremely grateful if you sent a donation our way. You can kick a little or a lot towards us, and we will be very thankful. It's claremont.org/donate to do that. Finally, a great way to spread the word about this podcast is to give it 5 stars wherever you're currently listening. The second best way is to keep whatever negative opinions you may have to yourself, or at least message them privately to us. But 5 stars would be very much appreciated, as would a share on socials or in your group chat or among your family or wherever. Just help us get the podcast out there, please, and grow the show. We would really appreciate that. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.